Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey so slow, so bureaucratic, so sleepily procedural that you'll be begging for the sweet release of a medieval tax audit instead. We're talking about the dusty, clunky, red tape-riddled path of a single papal letter in the 1400s from its humble request to its forgotten filing. Picture uneven cobblestones, the smell of old vellum, and a whole lot of quills being dipped in ink while someone argues over Latin syntax. You probably won't survive this with your eyes open. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see who's up way past bedtime with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the dim reception hall of a diocesan chancery office. It smells like candle grease, damp stone, and the particular mustiness of legal drama that's been left to stew since 1389. The torchlight flickers across the faces of minor clerics in scratchy robes, their hairline tonsures, catching the glow like tiny moon phases in retreat. You've waited 4 hours for someone to acknowledge you, which frankly is ahead of schedule. You've come to request a papal letter. Not just any letter, this one needs to convey divine permission for your abbot to use extra land. Or perhaps it's to declare someone's marriage invalid because of fourth cousin overlap. The exact content doesn't matter, really. What matters is that you're about to learn just how long it takes for the gears of ecclesiastical communication to grind. A bored cleric finally beckons you forward with the same energy you might use to pick up a sock. He asks your business in a tone that strongly suggests he hopes it's a smallpox-related death. When you explain your request, he sighs in a practiced, audible way that clerics develop in training. Then he pulls out a form, yes, a form, and begins the first of many necessary Latin entries, each word carefully spelled to avoid charges of blasphemy or worse clerical error. You sign where instructed, probably misspelling your own name, but no one cares. This is just the application to make a request. It has to go to the local bishop first, who will decide if your issue is worth troubling the papal court. Historians still argue whether these gatekeeping bishops genuinely read these pleas or just weighed the vellum and judged by thickness. Your document is rolled sealed with a regional sigil made of pressed red wax and bundled with 6 others going out that week. The courier will leave in 2 days, assuming no weather war or divine signs tell him otherwise. You're told you'll be notified if the bishop forwards your request to Rome or Avignon, depending on which pope you recognize this decade. The church is in one of its occasional "we have 2 popes" faces. You don't know which one is the real one. Honestly, neither does the bishop. He just sends copies to both and hopes one bites. Now, the letter sits in the bishop's chambers. Not his actual room, no. There's an outer chamber specifically for low-priority correspondence. And yours is lounging among hunting permits, marriage disputes, and at least one exorcism request written in suspiciously neat calligraphy. There's no guarantee he'll even look at it this month. He finally does during a rainy Tuesday with nothing else to do. After a half-hearted read, he decides, yes, this is just annoying enough to push upstairs. The bishop doesn't write the letter himself, of course. He drafts a summary, sticks it to your original parchment with a sewn thread glue being far too Wild West for such things, and passes it on to a clerical secretary with permanent ink stains on his fingers, and the aura of someone who hasn't blinked since Epiphany. This secretary must now transcribe your request into a formal template that will make sense to papal scribes. Here's a fun tidbit: the church uses so many standard phrases in these letters that there's an entire book of formulas, like medieval Mad Libs for holy communication. Your situation is plugged in like a software variable surrounded by phrases like salutem et apostolicam, benedictionem, greetings and apostolic blessings, and datum sub annulo piscatoris given under the ring of the fisherman. A phrase that sounds more dramatic than it is. You'd think this would speed things up, but no. Every case has to be massaged slightly to avoid theological ambiguity. One misplaced clause, and suddenly your land grant sounds like a declaration of war. The church has rules, and the rules have rules, and sometimes the margins are full of doodled saints because even monks get bored. The letter is now translated into Latin so pristine it could clean your soul. It's carefully folded, not once, not twice, but thrice, and wrapped in a protective outer sheet of parchment. The bishop's seal is reapplied because nothing says official like stamping an eagle into warm wax with terrifying force. The letter is now considered recommendatum ad curiam papalum, recommended to the papal court. You don't see any of this, of course. You're long gone, probably tending fields or complaining about soup. But somewhere in an office full of coughs and goose-feather quills, your bureaucratic baby is crawling toward the Holy See, at a pace that would make snails shake their heads in pity. The bishop's secretary updates the ledger. Your letter is assigned a number. It's noted in a margin by a man who likely considers margin notes his life's work. Historians still argue whether these ledgers were ever audited, or if their purpose was entirely spiritual, a sort of sacramental receipt. Your letter now rests in a sealed tube packed with others ready to be shipped. All this just to maybe begin its journey toward the Pope. Maybe. You can almost hear it breathing curled up in darkness, waiting to be noticed. Far from your calloused hands and hopeful eyes tucked behind thick limestone walls in the bustling papal chancery of Avignon, or perhaps Rome, depending on this decade's winner of the most legitimate pope debate, a man with the spine of a question mark sharpens his quill. He is a scribe. Specifically, a scribe of formulaic communications, which is about as thrilling as it sounds. His desk is warped from decades of elbow grease and faint despair, and the candlelight trembles over ink pots and scroll fragments like nervous guests at a dinner party. This morning, like every morning, he checks the pile of pending letters. He grunts. The stack leans to the left, a bad omen. Your letter freshly arrived from your bishop's office and sealed in ribbons, and hope is in that stack. It will wait its turn like everyone else. Scribes like him are trained to detect the subtle difference between land usage petition and doctrine-shaking controversy. Yours, alas, falls under the former. That means it won't require theological consultation, or worse, a visit from the theologians. It's a paperwork case, hurrah, and so the scribe gives a faint nod and pulls it toward himself with fingers permanently smudged with ink and almond oil. Before writing, he reads the bishop's summary and mutters a few things under his breath. One of them sounds suspiciously like, "not again." See, your bishop is known for verbose marginalia and poorly punctuated Latin. The scribe now has to untangle it like a knotted shoelace written in cursive. He sighs deeply. Then the ritual begins. First quill selection. He tests 3. The second squeaks. The third leaves a blot. He goes back to the first. Next, ink. This particular ink contains iron gall, a standard choice that eats slightly into parchment as it dries, darkening over time like a passive-aggressive message from the past. Then he smooths the page with a bit of pumice and breathes deeply because papal documents cannot contain errors. Errors are heresy adjacent. You do not want to be heresy adjacent in the 1400s. He begins carefully. The introductory formula is almost muscle memory by now. He writes, En servis servorum, de delecto filio, En servant of the servants of God to our beloved Son, and continues in sweeping, majestic script. Your humble request is now framed in the grandeur of ecclesiastical prose so elevated it could practically levitate. As the letter unfolds, there's a noticeable shift in tone. The scribe can't help it. He's been writing these for 23 years and occasionally sneaks in some personal flair. Maybe a metaphor involving sheep. Maybe an unusually poetic line about divine favor. One time he wrote an entire sentence in the shape of a fish just to see if anyone noticed. Still, it's serious business. The language must match canon law. Papal letters fall into categories: literae communes, literae secretae, bullae breviae, and each has its own required phrasing signature and ink color. Yours is a fairly standard Littera Apostolica, a public apostolic letter. Nothing too scandalous. But still, the formatting must be exact. Historians still argue whether the ink color mattered symbolically or just indicated which inkwell was closest. The scribe pauses to cough, drinks a little watered wine, and resumes. Now here's a quirk. Papal scribes sometimes included what are known as invisible marks. Tiny extra curls or accents that weren't part of the Latin but helped identify forgeries. These scribbles, barely visible, worked like secret passwords written in glyphs. Some scholars today try to decode them, unsure whether they're security features or just signs that the scribe was bored and liked to doodle. Midway through the document, the scribe inserts a reference to canon law, a dry citation that nobody will actually look up, and ties your request to a precedent from the reign of Pope Boniface VIII. He doesn't know what that precedent was exactly, but it sounds authoritative, and that's half the job. And now the jokes write themselves halfway through the ink runs out. The scribe mutters something that rhymes with Benedict, but probably isn't a prayer. He blots the page, gently sets it aside, and prepares a new ink mix. Iron gall ink is temperamental. Too much vinegar and it smells like feet. Too little and it fades in sunlight. He gets it just right, or as close as anyone gets in the 15th century, and resumes his sacred scribbling. Outside bells ring to mark midday. Another scribe sneezes violently in the hallway, startling 2 pigeons and a low-ranking clerk. The scent of lentil stew wafts in, but the scribe does not waver. He finishes your letter in one sitting, a small miracle given the number of ways medieval documents could be derailed. He signs it with the required phrase, Datum Romae sub annulo piscatoris die, and then the date. It's written in the style of the Roman Church's internal calendar system, which involves enough saints' days and lunar observations to make modern tax codes look charming. The last step proofreading. Yes, even in the 1400s, someone else has to double-check the scribe's work. This task falls to a second scribe known mostly for his astonishing ability to read upside down. He scans the text, makes a soft noise of approval, and adds a minuscule mark in the corner as sign-off. If he found an error, the original scribe would have had to start over, from scratch, with a new parchment. After writing I accept penance 37 times, you are blissfully unaware of any of this, but somewhere in a room thick with ink fumes and the sound of feathered nibs scratching across skin, your letter now exists in Papal Latin, beautiful and bureaucratic and 100% real. It is ready for the next step. Now that your papal letter has been lovingly birthed into being by a weary scribe's ink-stained hands, it's time for the ceremonial cherry on top the seal. In the 1400s, a papal letter without a proper seal is like a knight without armor, or a medieval stew without something unidentifiable floating in it. Technically edible, but no one trusts it. The sealing room is tucked behind the chancery's main hall, quieter than a confession booth at dusk. Here the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of beeswax and molten tin. There's a low crackle from a brazier used to heat the wax, and a table cluttered with metal dies, ribbon shears and threads in various ecclesiastical colors, red for blood, martyrs, purple for dignity, green for, well, green, because someone once ordered too much of it. A man with hands like oven mitts and eyebrows thicker than rope stands ready. He's the custodian sigillorum, the seal custodian. Not a glamorous title, but among clerical circles he carries real power. He's the only one, yes, the only one authorized to press the official lead seal of the Pope onto certain classes of documents. Rumor has it he once fell asleep mid-sealing and left a bully imprint on his own face. Your letter is brought to him on a wooden tray, flanked by 2 assistants who handle it like it's the Ark of the Covenant. The custodian inspects it, nods gravely, and tests the wax's readiness with a small metal spoon. The wax must be firm but pliable like undercooked bread crust. He positions the seal called the bulla, from which the term papal bull is derived, over the ribbon that threads through slits in the parchment. He presses down hard. The bulla bears the faces of Saints Peter and Paul on one side and the reigning pope's name on the other. And just like that, your letter becomes official. Well, almost. Next comes the signature, except the Pope doesn't actually sign these letters. That would take far too much time, and popes are busy people, what with wars, schisms, and occasionally arguing with the French. Instead, the Pope's name is subscribed, written by a specialized notary who is trained to copy his name so perfectly it could fool even the real Pope. This person, the Subscriptor Apostolicus, dips a new quill reserved only for names and inscribes the papal name with reverent loops and curlicues that would make modern calligraphers weep. The ink used for this red. Always red. Red ink was reserved for the highest authorities, and the Pope's name must practically bleed off the parchment. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic of martyrdom or just meant to keep things festive. After the name, there's often a flourish of fish, perhaps. Why? Because the Pope is, after all, the successor of St. Peter the Fisherman. This is where that lovely phrase sub annulo piscatorius under the ring of the fisherman comes back. The Pope's ring, which bears a carving of a fishing scene, is used to impress certain documents and signify their spiritual authority. For your letter, that motif may be referenced even if the physical ring isn't involved. It's more of a branding thing now. Like medieval SEO. Now comes a tricky bit: folding. Letters weren't just stuffed into envelopes, those come centuries later. They were folded in intricate patterns that could signify their purpose, confidentiality, and sometimes even the recipient's rank. Your letter is folded into a triptych 3 panels, then bound with a red and yellow silk thread, knotted so complexly that only another clerk trained in untying ecclesiastical knots can open it without damaging the seal. This is a process so slow and so delicate, it's rumored one monk once went into a trance while watching it, and came out 3 days later speaking only in liturgical Latin. With the folding done, the letter is slid into a reinforced parchment sleeve, essentially medieval bubble wrap, and labeled with a summary title and delivery code. These codes, an early form of metadata, include who requested it, what diocese it's for, and which poor courier will have to haul it halfway across Europe with only goats for company. That's when things go sideways, because a minor argument breaks out over the date. See, the scribes dated the letter by the Roman calendar, but the sealing office insists on using the feast day system. Is it the Feast of Saint Blais or the Vigil of Saint Agatha? The calendar on the wall is from last year. No one wants to admit they don't know. A small council is called. A debate ensues. In the end, the custodian just shrugs and adds both. Redundancy was a virtue back then. As your letter rests under its fresh wax, bearing the marks of ecclesiastical authority and several ounces of tradition, a clerk makes an entry in the registry book. This mammoth tome is chained to a lectern to prevent theft or, more plausibly, accidental collapse under its own weight. The clerk, who might be 18 or 87, it's hard to tell squints as he scribes a one-line summary of your letter into a volume that looks like it was rebound during the Black Death. Interestingly, it's this part of the process that survives most often to modern historians. These registry entries, dry as stale altar bread, are the breadcrumbs by which scholars reconstruct entire centuries of papal administration. And yes, historians still argue whether some of the registry entries were embellished by bored clerks trying to spice up their day. Finally, the sealed and signed letter is laid on a cloth-covered tray and placed in the outbound box, a wooden cabinet, that looks suspiciously like a bread box with ambition. There it waits for a courier to claim it. Sometimes it waits a while. Couriers are, let's say, independent spirits. But that's for tomorrow. For now, your letter lies complete, sealed with the full weight of the Vicar of Christ, trimmed with ribbons, stamped with saints, signed in papal red, and folded like a bureaucratic origami swan. And it hasn't even moved yet. Your papal letter, now a finely folded bundle of theological endorsement and ribboned ceremony, lies quietly in the outbound cabinet like a loaf of holy bread waiting to be delivered unto the world. It's done everything it can, really, and now it waits. But couriers in the 1400s don't operate on the kind of strict schedules we might expect today. There's no medieval FedEx, no daily dispatch time, and certainly no customer tracking number. Instead, couriers work on something called eventual momentum. That is, they leave when they feel like it, or more precisely when the Chancery assigns them a viable route with at least 3 other letters going in the same vague direction. This is where you meet Giorgio. He's the designated cursores apostolatae, an apostolic courier, although most people just call him Horseface behind his back, due to his long jaw and the fact that he's rarely seen without his mule. His mule is named Margarita. She has one eye and a limp, but she's survived 4 wars, 2 floods, and a brief exorcism, so no one questions her credentials. Giorgio shows up 3 days after your letter is sealed. He smells faintly of garlic and distant rain. The registrar hands him a satchel containing your letter, and 4 others, one addressed to a cathedral in Naples, one bound for Avignon, and 2 that will eventually be redirected to God knows where. Before he departs, Giorgio is handed a small folded card listing all the stops he's supposed to make. It's written in a mix of Latin place names and abbreviations no living man fully understands. Some of these include likely Via Normale, PP, possibly Porta Praetoria, and one symbol that resembles a chicken mid-sneeze. Scholars still argue whether this was a legitimate notation or a spilled ink blot that got canonized by mistake. He tucks the letters into a leather pouch, tightens it with wax string, and secures the whole thing under his cloak like a traveling saint of paperwork. Then, with a tired grunt, he hoists himself onto Margarita and sets off one hoof step at a time. Now let's talk roads. You might imagine Giorgio galloping off heroically down a Roman road, golden light behind him and Gregorian chants in the distance. But no. He starts with a slow trudge over mud-caked cobbles, lined with market refuse and animal excretions. Medieval road maintenance is what we'd call aspirational. Some routes are broken Roman roads still useful after 1,000 years because Roman engineering was terrifyingly good. Others are just goat trails with dreams. Even in Rome, most main roads are wide enough for one mule and one philosophical argument. Outside the city, Giorgio must navigate forest river crossings and the occasional noble toll booth where a minor baron charges passage in exchange for 1 coin, 2 compliments, and any interesting gossip. He travels south first toward your region. His pace is steady about 20 miles a day depending on weather bandits and whether Margarita is in the mood. Remember, this is a world where even letters must stop for lunch. As he moves through the countryside, Giorgio stays at Mansione as a kind of postal inn for couriers and messengers. These aren't charming cottages with feather beds and warm bread. They're more like fortified sheds with straw mats and soup that might still contain identifiable vegetables if you're lucky. But these way stations are important. They're where letters are sometimes rerouted, copied, or if they're really unlucky, misplaced entirely. This is why the papal chancery often made duplicates of key letters and kept them on file. Historians still argue whether these backups were an early attempt at document redundancy, or just a way for clerks to prove they actually did something all day. One night somewhere near Velletri, Giorgio stops at a church-run hospice. The monk running it offers him a bowl of barley gruel and asks, "Anything juicy in the satchel?" Giorgio doesn't answer, but nods at the seal on your letter. The monk whistles. Papal Giorgio shrugs. They're all Papal. Still, the monk grins. I wouldn't want to lose that one. Neither would you. Let's pause for a second and appreciate that couriers didn't just risk delays, they risked death. Bandits were real, so were wolves. And both had a healthy disrespect for ecclesiastical mail. To avoid theft, some letters were written in vague coded Latin or even disguised inside mundane-looking parchment rolls. But yours is too formal for that. It's basically a billboard for "Steal me, I'm important." So, Giorgio travels with a dagger and a wooden cross. One for protection, one for persuasion. Depending on the situation, he's not entirely sure which is which. By the 5th day, he's close to your diocese. He hands off 2 letters at a Franciscan monastery and finally reaches the bishop's residence just before dusk. Mud up to his knees and the vague sense he might have hallucinated a talking pig somewhere near the last crossroads. He's greeted not with fanfare, but with a grunt from the bishop's assistant, who has been expecting the letter for days and is already composing a preemptive apology in case it got lost. The assistant signs a receipt on a wooden tablet, gives Giorgio a cup of watered wine, and ushers him back outside. Giorgio leaves without fanfare. Margarita sneezes. Their job is done for now. Your letter is now officially in the diocese, but it hasn't been opened yet. That part is a whole ceremony. Because when a letter arrives from the Pope, even one about grazing rights or whether a certain parish counts as sufficiently holy, everyone gets very dramatic about it. And so, your document rests once again on a velvet pillow in a quiet room, waiting to be unveiled like some delicate relic. Your letter has made it. Or at least it's arrived mud-splattered and slightly crumpled from travel, but still sealed, still intact, and still humming with the soft, latent authority of St. Peter's proverbial signature. But just because the document is physically present in the bishop's palace doesn't mean it gets opened right away. Oh no, that would be far too efficient for the 1400s. Instead, it must be ceremoniously received. You find yourself now in the episcopal residence, an austere cluster of stone halls and drafty rooms with uneven floors, and an ever-present smell of damp linen. The bishop, a man with a cough like a creaky door and a face perpetually stuck in mid-disapproval, is informed discreetly by his assistant that a letter bearing the seal of the Apostolic See has arrived. This triggers what's known locally as a dignified scramble. Everyone who's anyone, or at least anyone who enjoys sitting in the bishop's good graces, tries to position themselves for the opening. There's the archdeacon, of course, and the canon who always shows up to things even when uninvited, plus a monk who's been hanging around for days under the vague pretense of reviewing tithe records. The letter is carried into the bishop's study on a silver tray, okay pewter, but it's polished and dramatic enough to pass for silver in candlelight. The seal is still affixed. The ribbons trail gracefully, and the document rests as if it knows it's about to be the center of attention. No one dares to open it except the bishop himself, and even he hesitates holding it like it might explode into incense and hallelujahs. There's a theatrical pause, a deep breath. Then, using a knife that doubles as a fruit peeler, he cuts the seal's threads and unfolds the parchment with the reverence usually reserved for relics or exceptionally good gossip. Now the reading begins. Papal letters from the 15th century are not, shall we say, written for speed reading. They open with a long, slow wind-up, something like, Eugenius, servant of the servants of God, to our beloved Son in Christ, the most reverend bishop of insert your local corner of the world here. Then there's a page and a half of qualifications, scriptural allusions, subtle flexes of divine authority, and polite but unmistakable reminders that ignoring this letter would basically be a one-way ticket to theological awkwardness. The bishop reads it aloud, slowly, painfully, mispronouncing at least 3 Latin words, though no one corrects him because his glare can curdle milk. The letter, as expected, concerns a rather technical ecclesiastical issue, something to do with the boundaries of a parish, or the appointment of a subdeacon, or whether Brother Paolo is actually allowed to keep his wine press on monastic land. You feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. It is, let's not sugarcoat it, mind-numbingly boring. Still, every man in the room nods solemnly as though the Pope himself has just handed down the 10 Commandments Redux. And in a way he has. Because this letter, though dripping in bureaucratic curlicues and spiritual cross-references, is legally and spiritually binding, there's one passage in particular that gives everyone pause. A clause with so many sub-clauses, it's basically a paragraph made of legal spaghetti. It refers to a previous decree issued by another pope, which was itself a clarification of a canon, which was in response to a synodal dispute from 1273. Historians still argue whether this part was necessary or just included to fill out the page. After reading, the bishop pauses. He reads it again, and then once more, this time to himself. Then comes a muttered, this is a problem. You see, the letter's language is not entirely clear. There's a Latin construction in the middle that could be read 2 ways. Either the bishop has been granted permission to reassign certain funds, or he's being explicitly forbidden from touching them. The difference is a few vowels and about 700 florins. This is what we call a medieval translation crisis. The canon immediately offers an interpretation, conveniently one that aligns with his own financial interests. The monk offers another, citing a sermon he once heard in Bologna. The archdeacon just mutters something about papal clarity being a divine mystery, which is both unhelpful and annoyingly true. What follows is an hour-long debate over intentio scriptoris, the intention of the author, and whether the Pope meant what he seems to have written, or wrote what he might have meant, or possibly neither. You begin to suspect the whole point of the letter was to create work for interpreters. Eventually, someone suggests writing back for clarification. Cue the collective sigh. No one wants to do this. Writing back means another request, another fee, another round, through the papal bureaucratic blender. But it might be necessary. Because if the bishop acts on a faulty interpretation, he risks overstepping ecclesiastical authority, and no one wants to end up excommunicated because of a Latin participle. Meanwhile, the letter is placed gently on the bishop's desk, pinned under a polished stone to keep it from curling. Its wax seal, now severed, lies beside it like a spent bullet. It has served its purpose, sort of. A scribe is summoned to begin drafting a concilium, an internal opinion on the letter's meaning, to be sent to the archdiocese for further comment. The scribe brings a long feather quill and a face that says he had other plans for the evening. Before leaving the room, the bishop folds the letter again carefully, not precisely as it was, but enough to show respect. It will be archived soon once it has served as the basis for whatever next step the diocese chooses. Likely it will end up in a wooden cabinet filled with other papal documents labeled with a small tag forgotten, until someone 50 years from now decides to write a treatise on 15th century tithe management. And thus, your papal letter, which has traveled across cities and hills, passed through chancery chambers and mule-scented valleys, is now reduced to a paperwork dilemma. One that's going to need at least 3 more clerics a week of debate and possibly a bottle of sacramental wine to resolve. Welcome to church administration. So now your papal letter is sitting on a desk slightly crooked under that polished stone, quietly radiating bureaucratic dread. It's been read aloud, debated over, and argued into a Latin corner so narrow even Cicero would throw up his hands. But the fun doesn't stop there, oh no, because now it's time to make things official. That means copying. You might think this involves popping over to the cathedral scriptorium and knocking out a few quick duplicates, but this is the 1400s, remember. There are no carbon copies, no Xerox, and absolutely no coil-play-see. Copying a letter, especially one from the Pope, is a full-blown production. It's how bureaucracy stretches time into a soft, never-ending yawn. Enter the diocesan notarius. A local scribe, typically someone who's taken minor orders and can write faster than a sleepy goat can chew cud. He has a small chamber that smells of ink sheep parchment and failed ambition. His hands are permanently stained a melancholy shade of black, and his back is shaped like a question mark. His name might be Pietro, or Giovanni, or literally anything else because no one writes down the names of the guys who write everything else. He receives the letter with a sigh and a tiny bow. This is not his first papal copy request. In fact, it's his 5th this month, and one of them involved 3 separate appendices and a diagram about altar placements. He smooths the letter on his workbench and begins preparing the parchment. Not paper, of course. Actual animal skin, treated and scraped until smooth. You can still feel faint whirls from where the cow once had a particularly itchy flank. The copying begins. Line by line. Curl by curl. This is no rushed transcription. Each capital letter is rendered with ornamental care flourished in red or blue ink, with the occasional doodle in the margins that may or may not be a passive-aggressive joke about the bishop's nose. Historians still argue whether these scribal embellishments were artistic expressions or early forms of workplace protest. As he works, the notarius mutters each word aloud under his breath, a common habit among medieval scribes. It's part memory aid, part exorcism of boredom. You can hear a low hum of Eugenius' servant of the servants of God, followed by a sigh and a scratch of the pen. Then more Latin, then a sneeze. Then more Latin. This single copy will be archived locally bound into a register known as the Liber Cossarum, or Liber Bellarum, depending on the diocese's filing preferences. These were the medieval equivalent of a filing cabinet. If your cabinet was made of wooden boards wrapped in goat leather and weighed more than a toddler, some dioceses kept beautiful copies. Others looked like they were scribbled by someone mid-nap. Quality varied wildly. And here's a quirky twist: in some especially chaotic dioceses, scribes would slip in secret comments between lines in microscript. Nothing scandalous, just notes like "wrong again, bishop." Or "this makes no theological sense" in tiny medieval sarcasm font. While Pietro, Jews, not Giovanni, is busy preserving your letter for all eternity, or until mold gets it, another copy is commissioned to be sent to the archbishop. You see, the bishop is under his jurisdiction, and the archbishop needs to be informed in case the papal letter contradicts something he said 2 years ago, at a synod attended mostly by people pretending not to sleep. This means the diocesan courier system kicks in again. Enter Marco, a younger, perkier mule wrangler who dreams of moving to Venice and starting a scroll copying business. He's been waiting 3 days for an assignment, so he practically gallops to the bishop's residence when summoned. He's handed the freshly copied letter, still slightly damp, and a pouch containing a modest travel allowance, 2 slices of hard bread, and a dried fig. Not exactly high living, but then again, Marco didn't sign up for glamour. He mounts his slightly more cheerful mule named Agostina and starts north. The journey to the archdiocese is shorter, but not without its hazards. The weather has turned sullen, with skies threatening the kind of rain that makes parchment curl like the bishop's wig. Marco keeps the letter in a waxed pouch under his tunic, where it absorbs both body heat and the faint aroma of garlic sausage. If the archbishop ever wonders why his mail smells like lunch, now you know. 2 days in, Marco stops at a tiny roadside chapel and asks the friar if he can bless the satchel. The friar says sure, but adds a 5-penny surcharge for spiritual thoroughness. Medieval spirituality, it turns out, is often subject to transaction fees. Meanwhile, back at the bishop's palace, Pietro is finishing the 3rd copy of the letter. Why a 3rd? Because church bureaucracy loves redundancy almost as much as it loves metaphors involving sheep. This one will be sent to the local abbey, which technically isn't involved but has a strong opinion on everything and a habit of archiving letters out of pure pettiness. As you watch this process unfold copy after copy, mule after mule, you start to realize something profound. This isn't just about a letter. It's about ritual, stability, repetition. There's a reason why the church survives plagues, wars, famines, and the occasional surprise Viking raid. It documents, it copies, it reaffirms. Every letter is a thread in a slow-spinning web of order. And yes, that web is often tangled and dull, but it's there, unfurling across miles, across monastic walls, across time. But now the copied letter is arriving at the archbishop's seat. He receives it with a raised eyebrow, recognizing the bishop's seal before even opening it. It takes him all of 7 seconds to skim the contents. He's seen this sort of thing before, a classic case of ambiguous papal Latin, paired with minor ecclesiastical drama. He exhales deeply and signals for his scribe. This new scribe, younger and more enthusiastic, is thrilled to be part of the process. He begins a reply immediately using phrases like seeking clarification on jurisdictional ambiguity and in accordance with the previous papal directive, as interpreted through canonical norms. You're probably asleep just reading that, which is exactly what makes it perfect. And so the archbishop prepares to send his own letter back to Rome. Yes, you guessed it, your original papal letter is now going in reverse. Like a very slow boomerang made of vellum and riddled with confusion. A new courier is summoned. The process restarts. All because one phrase might have meant may instead of must. The archbishop's reply, with its flourished Latin and slightly smug overtones, is now tucked neatly into a cylindrical case made of boiled leather and horn. Basically the 15th century version of a diplomatic suitcase. It's wax sealed with his own insignia and includes a small folded note from his scribe requesting clarification in humble obedience to the Holy See. Which is, of course, polite code for, can someone in Rome please explain what on earth that last letter meant? Your papal missive, now copied, commented on, and questioned, is making its way back to the apostolic chancery. The return journey is not glamorous. This time the courier is a man named Ludovico. He's not young, he's not particularly enthusiastic. He's also got gout. But what he does have is a letter of passage from the archbishop, which means he can commandeer beds in monasteries along the way and demand soup with slightly more peas in it than the average traveler. Ludovico also has opinions. Many. He believes the church has become far too obsessed with documentation. He believes no one should be allowed to write a sentence longer than 10 words. And he especially believes papal letters should not include rhetorical devices because they just confuse the goats, which is both a metaphor and a reference to a real incident. He trudges on, through sleet, through fog, through the kind of icy rain that makes even your toenails cold. The roads are worse now, gouged by cartwheels and partially frozen. At one point, Ludovico has to wait 2 days at a monastery because the bridge over the river has partially collapsed under the weight of a cartload of fish sauce. Back in Rome, however, the apostolic chancery hums along like nothing ever left. Here, nestled in a complex of offices tucked behind the Lateran Basilica, the bureaucracy of the papacy carries on at full tilt. Dozens of clerks are at work, some transcribing others, drafting, many sipping lukewarm wine and sighing heavily. The return of the bishop's query is received by one of the mid-level officials who takes one look at the seal and immediately knows what kind of week he's about to have. See, once a papal letter is sent out and responded to, it triggers something known as a rescriptio. a formal reply issued by or on behalf of the Pope to clarify or modify the earlier instruction. And yes, this rescript must be drafted, checked, debated, translated, reviewed, copied, signed, sealed, archived, and then, of course, sent. But first, analysis. The original document, the bishop's comments, and the archbishop's remarks must all be reviewed. This job falls to a specialist known as an auditor curie. Think of him as the Vatican's internal legal analyst, but in a robe. He wears small spectacles that pinch the bridge of his nose and makes a whistling sound when he exhales, which is often. The auditor reads the documents while sipping what might be wine or might be vinegar. He scribbles notes in the margins like ambiguous use of subjunctive and unclear whether bishop intends to relocate funds or just look at them wistfully. Historians still argue whether the auditors had real decision-making power or were just glorified proofreaders with better desks. Once his notes are complete, he forwards the case to a senior cardinal. One of those deeply wrinkled men who can read 5 pages without blinking. The cardinal predictably kicks it back with a question. Was this matter not addressed in the decree of Martin V? No one is sure, so now someone must go digging through dusty codices. Cue the archivist. He's thrilled. He's been waiting for this moment. He disappears into the storage vault like a mole in a cassock, emerging hours later with a parchment dated 1430, stained with what might be wine or medieval blood pudding. It does contain a relevant passage, but of course it contradicts the current interpretation. Now we have a real problem. So what happens next? A meeting. Imagine 5 robed clerics seated at a long, ink-stained table with a candle dripping wax onto a map of northern Italy. They debate. They quote scripture. They compare clauses. Someone says, "This is why the Greeks left," which gets a chuckle. Another mutters, "Why not just send a second bull?" and receives a glare so withering it peels paint from the far wall. Eventually, consensus is reached. The Pope, who is likely not involved in the day-to-day mechanics of this particular case, is informed in a summary document no longer than 1 page. He glances at it, nods once, and blesses it with a faint sign of the cross. Whether he actually understands what the issue is remains a matter of conjecture both then and now. The rescriptio is prepared. It begins with a formal acknowledgement of the original letter, followed by a clarification in equally complex Latin that attempts to untangle the confusion without admitting any fault in the first letter. It includes phrases like "in light of the faithful's concerns" and "as heretofore unexamined distinctions" may imply, which sound helpful but are mostly decorative. There's also a footnote referencing the decree from Martin V, now newly reinterpreted. It will cause headaches for at least 3 other dioceses once they read it. The final touch, a wax seal. Different from the first, this one in red indicating a clarificatione rather than an addictum. The ribbons are now green and gold, signifying a non-urgent but still binding communication. Yes, even the ribbon colors had bureaucratic meaning. You didn't think medieval Catholicism would skip over color coding, did you? And with that, the letter begins its return journey again. Another courier, another mule, another dusty trail out of Rome. But this time it carries with it a sense of resolution, or at least the illusion of resolution, because as it heads north, the Vatican clerks do what they always do. Log the response file, the copies note the decree's implications for other cases, and most importantly, add the original question to a long list of topics that may need future revisiting, which is Vaticanese for "we'll deal with this again, probably in 20 years. You sigh. Somewhere your original papal letter, the reason for this whole opera of vellum and vowels, is still pinned under that polished stone. Quiet. Patient. Maybe even a little smug. But don't worry, it's not done yet. You'd think that now with the papal response clarified, reworded, resealed, and re-ribboned, the saga of your humble letter might be winding down. But, oh no. That would be far too merciful. Because now the rescriptio has to be enforced. And enforcement in the 1400s. That's not just a matter of forwarding a memo or nudging a button marked "comply." No. It's a labyrinth of middlemen, ministers, monks, and the occasional guy who probably just wanted to be left alone to prune his grapevines. Your new letter arrives at the Archbishop's court with only minor mule damage. He breaks the seal, reads it through twice, once with a furrowed brow, once with narrowed eyes, and finally grunts in ecclesiastical acceptance. It confirms his suspicion that the Pope's original letter wasn't incorrect per se, just susceptible to layered interpretation. Historians still argue whether that phrase was a masterstroke of diplomacy or just Latin tap dancing. He calls in a synod a formal council of local bishops, abbots, and other church authorities, ostensibly to disseminate the updated directive, but really because nobody wants to bear the risk of interpreting this mess solo. Accountability, like wine at a medieval banquet, is best diluted. Now, synods in the 1400s were a delightfully strange mix of solemn ritual and petty squabbles. Picture a room full of elderly men in heavy robes all sitting on uncomfortable wooden benches, while low-ranking clerics scurry about with jugs of watered wine and notes scribbled on bark. There's a distinct aroma of beeswax, wet wool, and sanctified mildew. You're there sort of because your letter is read aloud again in its full rescripted glory. There's a long pause after the fourth paragraph when a bishop with a wheezy cough says, "Wait, did that clause just contradict itself?" A younger monk dares to answer, "It's a nuanced contradiction, Your Grace." This does not go over well. The rest of the synod is spent parsing verbs. One abbot insists that the Latin committiture implies delegation of power. Another swears it denotes moral obligation. Meanwhile, a third cleric takes the opportunity to suggest rather slyly that perhaps the issue wouldn't exist if dioceses maintained better records. That earns him 3 dirty looks and a snide comment about certain monastic tendencies towards smugness. Amid all this, the archbishop nods, slowly hands steepled like a man about to pass judgment on a pie. Finally, he declares that the letter shall be enforced to the best of the Church's united understanding, which, if you're paying attention, is the theological version of crossing your fingers behind your back. From here, the enforcement chain unspools. The archbishop drafts a new circular, his own version of the papal clarification. This gets copied yes again by his scribes, who by now have developed calluses that rival that of long-distance sailors. This circular is less flowery, more direct, but still cautious. Because nobody wants to be the guy who misquotes the Pope and ends up assigned to supervise beehive repair in southern Albania. The circular goes to the bishops. The bishops read it, sigh, and summon their vicars' general trusted lieutenants, tasked with turning theological jelly into administrative bricks. These men then call for meetings with local priests. The trickle-down continues, and here's where it gets delightfully absurd. Some rural priests isolated in misty valleys or perched in craggy mountain hamlets receive this circular weeks or months later. The mule gets stuck in snow. A river floods. A bandit steals the satchel and uses the parchment to line his boots. Anything can happen, so enforcement becomes a matter of chance timing and personality. One priest might read the directive and immediately begin restructuring parish roles. Another might glance at the Latin, mutter, "Not this nonsense again," and shove it under a pile of moldy hymnals. Quirky tidbit time: in at least one recorded instance, a local priest confused a papal clarification letter with a tax notice and burned it in protest, which led to a minor inquisition and an even more minor apology. Meanwhile, enforcement isn't just about actions, it's about recording those actions. The dioceses now must send back confirmation notices. These are short, dry little affirmations that the directive has been received, understood, and implemented to the letter, even if that last part is only loosely true. These confirmations are drafted by the chancellors, signed by the bishops, sealed with thick red wax, and shipped guessware, yes, back to Rome. At this point, your original letter has not only made a round trip, it has spawned a whole family tree of documents. Replies, clarifications, summaries, implementation reports, and ecclesiastical "Yes, Father" notes. It's basically a Papal bureaucracy hydra. Every time you think it's finished, another parchment head appears. You can't help but marvel at the sheer durability of it all. This was a system without phones, emails, or spreadsheets, and yet through sheer human tenacity and probably a bit of terrified reverence, it functioned. Mostly. By now, the Apostolic Chancery is receiving a slow trickle of compliance reports. They're reviewed, stamped, and archived with varying degrees of enthusiasm. A junior scribe named Anselmo has the unfortunate task of cataloging them in the Liber Responsorum, a bound volume so thick it requires a small winch to lift. As he flips through the entries, Anselmo notices discrepancies. One bishop claims to have implemented the directive on March 3rd. Another in the same region claims the document arrived on March 17th. A third just writes understood and enacted accordingly, which is about as specific as saying, I sort of did a thing. But does anyone follow up? Not really. Because ultimately enforcement in this period wasn't about micromanagement. It was about appearance. You wrote the reports, you sealed the envelopes, you sent the letters. The performance of obedience was often more important than its reality. Still, in some places, real effects do ripple outward. A parish merges with another. A deacon is quietly reassigned. A small altar is moved 3 feet to the left, presumably to align with new liturgical guidance from the rescript. Someone paints a new mural of Saint Jerome with a slightly more expressive lion. Tiny changes, little echoes, all born from a single letter. And now with enforcement more or less rolling forward, you'd imagine we're nearing the end of the line. But you'd be wrong, because this dear sleeper is the Catholic Church in the 15th century. There's always another round of paperwork. You know, the letter's been received, debated, clarified, and halfway enforced. But what happens after that? Surely you think we're nearing some kind of bureaucratic sunset, a gentle tapering of ink and effort? Wrong again, dear insomniac pilgrim. Now comes the part where the papal letter enters the registry phase, a process so meticulous, so hopelessly archival, it might as well be a ceremony of its own. Because here in the apostolic chancery, no letter is truly finished, until it has been copied one final time onto a special register parchment, in a script so fine and tightly packed you'd swear it was written by monks using hummingbird beaks. This isn't your average filing cabinet routine. No, this is ecclesiastical eternity formatting. Let's go backstage. In the chancery's quieter wing, there's a scriptorium reserved for archiving official papal communications. The walls are lined with pigeonholes crammed with parchment rolls, beeswax tablets, and sheets of vellum that have curled with age like dried leaves. The clerks here wear fingerless gloves in the winter and linen head wraps in the summer, not for fashion, but to stop their sweat from dripping onto official documents. Your letter, well, a copy of the final rescriptio is handed off to one of these pale, ink-stained men. He's known as a registrator, which might sound important, but is really just Latin for the guy who copies things forever. He settles in at a long bench, lights a small oil lamp, cracks his knuckles, and begins the sacred task transcribing your papal letter. Its reply and its clarification, all in sequence with marginal notes and index numbers, written in a shorthand so cryptic it's basically medieval Sudoku. The final record is entered into one of the Vatican's vast Registra Vaticana volumes, a monstrous codex with oak covers and iron clasps. Each page crammed with spidery Gothic script is a blend of divine decree and footnoted fussiness. And here's your mainstream historical fact. For the night these volumes still exist, shelf after shelf of them now stored in the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Some are digitized. Some require special permission to even touch. But yes, your 15th century letter, or one exactly like it, is still sleeping somewhere under temperature-controlled lights and Latin whispers. Back in the scriptorium, your registrator isn't just copying, he's also annotating. Sea Church protocol required registrators to include brief context or remarks alongside particularly noteworthy papal letters. These weren't summaries exactly, they were more like interpretive footnotes meant to help future clerics understand the ever-growing paper trail of decisions, contradictions, and corrections. Your letter earns a note, something like clarification issued upon query by Archbishop of Parma, implemented with local synodal consultation, minor regional inconsistencies noted. It sounds tame, but it's a small badge of honor. Only a fraction of letters warranted even that much. Now comes the indexing. One clerk updates the annual rubricator, a kind of running inventory of all papal decisions issued that year. Each letter is given a category: disciplinary, doctrinal, financial, or administrative. Yours, it straddles two. That means it gets cross-indexed, filed in both rubrics, which instantly doubles the paperwork. Congratulations, you've achieved bureaucratic bifurcation. And let's not forget the language dilemma. The original was Latin, of course, but some copies are translated into vernacular tongues for local use. There's a quiet debate over whether the phrasing in the Tuscan version subtly undermines the spirit of the directive. Historians still argue whether these regional translations were a blessing for communication or a curse for consistency. But don't worry, there's more. Because while your letter is being immortalized in the Vatican's registers, copies of it are also being archived locally. The bishopric that first received it, it has a ledger too. Their scribes, not to be outdone by Rome, prepare their own version of the archival copy. It's written on local vellum, probably from a cow named Hilda, and stored in a damp cellar beneath the cathedral. This redundancy isn't just caution, it's strategy. Multiple copies mean resilience against fire war, or most commonly mold. And yes, mold was a recurring menace in medieval ecclesiastical filing. There's a record of one abbey's entire archive being lost to book rot, which sounds fake but was tragically very real. Imagine your life's work turning into damp, illegible linguini. Quirky tidbit: some monasteries actually used cats to patrol their archives, not for companionship, but to keep rodents from chewing on parchment. One famous 15th century manuscript has a paw print stamped into the margins. The monk simply wrote, "Here a cat walked across this text." Back in Rome, the registrar finally finishes your letter. He blots the ink, rolls his shoulders, mutters something about the inadequacies of quills made from inferior goose breeds, and stamps the page with the official registratum symbol, a tiny cross flanked by two ornate initials. That stamp means your letter is now part of the historical record. Forever. Unless, of course, someone loses it. Yes, even in the 1400s, things got misfiled. There are entire letters, some potentially world-changing, that have simply vanished. Historians now refer to them by their registry gaps, like missing teeth in a saint's smile. Your letter, however, seems to have survived. For now. But it's not just registrars who care. Scholars within the church, commentators, theologians, even rival curial factions read these letters. Study them. Annotate them. Sometimes quote them in other letters, which are then copied, registered, and indexed again. You see where this is going. So the archiving process isn't just an end, it's a beginning. Your papal letter becomes precedent. Next month, when another bishop faces a similar dilemma, they might cite your letter as justification. As declared in the clarification to the Parma decree, they'll begin, and off we go again. Another cycle. Another courier. Another soup with too many peas. In that way, your letter stops being yours. It becomes an instrument, a brick in the cathedral of policy, buried beneath centuries of additional layers, but still doing its quiet, papery work. And you're watching this all unfold from the bureaucratic afterlife, where retired letters sip archival wine and chuckle over misused subjunctives. Don't worry, though. Your letter's still got more steps to take. Because now that it's officially registered, indexed, and stored, and it needs to be referenced, by now your humble papal letter has climbed higher than any letter has a right to. It's been composed, delivered, questioned, clarified, enforced, and finally tucked into its little nest in the Vatican archives. If this were a film, you'd be rolling credits by now. But no, you're still very much in the second act. Because the next stage is reference, and this, strangely enough, is where your letter really starts to live. See, while some letters vanish quietly into dusty vaults never to be seen again, yours has stirred just enough theological fuss to become a minor citation celebrity. It's quoted, cited, argued over, used to justify everything from liturgical adjustments to internal clerical promotions. It's like the papal version of going viral, only with more Latin and fewer cats. It begins subtly. A bishop preparing to write his own letter to Rome glances through recent decrees. He's facing a vaguely similar dilemma, some ambiguity involving canon law, a tithing loophole, and whether Brother Matteo really does own 3 goats, or if they're communal goats borrowed under a monastic lease. He finds your letter in the annual rubricator flips to the registry entry and reads the clarification issued by the Pope. It's not exactly relevant, but close enough. And more importantly, it's recent. That's the key. In the medieval church, old authority was revered, but recent authority was powerful. Like wearing last year's mitre, it's still valid, but you'll look like you're stuck in 1443. So, the bishop drafts his own letter to Rome, and in it he writes as the Holy See. Affirmed in the matter of the Parma clarification, it is understood that such jurisdictional exceptions must be submitted with thorough diocesan records. Boom. Your letter has now been used as precedent. Which means it's entered the slippery world of clerical politics. Clerics start referencing it in letters, treatises, and even sermons. One especially dramatic friar cites it during a homily about divine order, arguing that if the Pope himself needed to clarify matters, then surely the common folk should forgive their baker for mixing up salt and sugar. And then the scholars arrive. Not the monks in damp scriptoria, but the university men, those tweedy proto-academics haunting the corridors of Bologna, Paris, and Salamanca. They get their hands on the rescripted version and include it in compilations of recent pontifical clarifications. These compilations are copied, passed around, and debated in smoky lecture halls. Now, here's your historical fact. Of the night in the 15th century, canon law faculties often used real papal letters as teaching tools. They weren't just dusty case studies, they were living documents. Students would analyze them for legal consistency, doctrinal soundness, and occasionally grammar. Yes, medieval finals sometimes involved identifying faulty verb tenses in papal Latin. Your letter is especially beloved for its subtle contradictions. One clause leans toward episcopal independence. Another implies direct papal oversight. Historians still argue whether this ambiguity was deliberate or just a consequence of one too many scribes working late under torchlight. Meanwhile, the letter's references grow recursive. A monk in Avignon references a commentary written by a priest in Cologne who was referencing an argument made by a canonist in Siena who was citing your letter. It's like watching your child go off to college, then get adopted by strangers, then write a memoir. And the church loves this. It thrives on continuity, on the idea that each new idea is built carefully atop the last. A papal letter becomes part of the doctrinal scaffolding, holding up a cathedral of thought. Not flashy, not glamorous, but essential. But not everyone agrees. In Florence, a group of reform-minded theologians reads the letter and rolls their collective eyes. They publish a cheeky pamphlet suggesting that the Rescriptio merely rearranges ambiguity with greater confidence. One even draws a little cartoon of a bishop holding a scroll that's clearly upside down. The pamphlet is quickly banned, of course, but a few copies slip through the cracks, and one survives in a private library tucked between a herbal remedy manual and a collection of mildly heretical jokes. Here comes your quirky tidbit. One copy of your letter, exactly how or why nobody knows, ends up being used as scrap parchment to bind a treatise on bee taxonomy. For centuries, scholars studying honeybee migration would occasionally encounter a footnote beginning in the matter of Parma's dispute, and simply carry on mildly confused. Meanwhile, the Vatican is keeping tabs. Every referenced use of a papal clarification like yours is ideally supposed to be reported back to Rome. Not because they're nosy, well, not just that, but because consistent reference helps the chancery understand how doctrine is being absorbed, distorted, or in some cases wildly misunderstood. A bored archivist flags the growing number of references to your letter. He notes that it's now been used to justify 5 minor diocesan reforms and one failed attempt to shorten the Lent fasting period. This last one is politely ignored, and of course the more it's referenced, the more it's vulnerable to reinterpretation. A particularly ambitious bishop writes a treatise that deliberately misquotes your letter, tweaking one verb to support his pet theory about clerical vestments. He sends this version to his neighbors, and suddenly half a province thinks the Pope endorsed knee-length tunics. The Vatican finds out, sends a correction, sends another correction, and now your once simple letter has sparked a minor fashion schism. You can't help but admire the chaos. A single papal clarification meant to settle a question of jurisdiction now has its fingerprints on vestment sermon content university syllabi and a truly mediocre drawing of a goat. This is the strange legacy of papal letters. They start as tools, then become precedents, then become myths. Soon priests will reference that famous Parma clarification without ever reading it. It becomes a kind of shorthand, a way to signal theological alignment. Like quoting Aristotle or citing a line from Cicero and pretending you didn't mispronounce it. Your letter, sealed in beeswax and carried by donkeys, now lives in the minds of 1,000 men. Some faithful, some conniving, some just very tired. And it's not done yet, because eventually someone's going to challenge it. And when they do, they'll demand a revision. So here we are. You thought the letter's job was done. Archiving, referencing, even accidental B-wrapping. But no, you underestimated one thing: the Church's unquenchable thirst for revision. Because nothing in the 15th century ever really stays settled. Not tax rates, not feast days, and definitely not papal clarifications. It starts innocently enough. A new archbishop is appointed in a region where your letter's precedent has been enforced for over a decade. Let's call him Archbishop Lucius, mostly because he sounds like someone who'd roll his eyes at paperwork, but still carry a pearl-handled ink knife. Lucius is a reformer, which is church speak. For likes rewriting things other people just got done finalizing. Lucius reviews your letter and its applications across his diocese. He finds that it's created a loophole one that some of his more opportunistic clergy have used to skip certain procedural steps. Nothing heretical, but let's just say the sacristan in Modena has been handing out dispensations like they're gingerbread at a feast day fair. So Lucius decides something must be done. A revision must be requested. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The process of requesting a revision to a papal letter in the 1400s was known as supplicatio pro revisione. It wasn't rare, but it was delicate. You couldn't just shout, "Hey, Holy Father, we think your last decree was a bit sloppy." No, you had to request reverently using very specific formulae, and with enough flattery to make a Renaissance courtier blush. Lucius assembles his canon lawyers. They draft the supplicatio with all the usual flourishes, with deepest humility, for the benefit of the Holy Church, and in the spirit of faithful obedience. It's basically the medieval equivalent of asking for an edit on your boss's PowerPoint by writing a 4-page ode to its elegance first. But here's the twist. Lucius isn't the only one with an opinion. Remember how your letter got referenced in academic circles, cited in sermons, and accidentally used to justify tunic lengths? That web of influence has created stakeholders. Some clerics like how the letter has been interpreted. Others have built minor empires around it. The idea of rewriting it threatens their position or their library footnotes or even their retirement plans. A flurry of counter-petitions is sent to Rome. Some argue the letter has become a cornerstone of regional canon law. Others point to theological essays that quote it. To revise the letter now would create doctrinal confusion, they warn. One dramatic bishop even suggests that changing the letter might lead to a schism. Spoiler, it won't, but nice try. And so the Curia begins its internal debates. The Congregation of the Apostolic Letters, which, yes, was a real committee, is tasked with reviewing the Supplicatio. They dig through archives, read every commentary, compared Latin phrasing across 3 different copies, and spend a whole afternoon trying to figure out whether the word immediate was meant literally or spiritually. Historians still argue whether papal phrasing was intentionally vague to preserve flexibility or simply the result of poor scribal editing. This is where the process gets truly absurd. In order to properly revise the letter, the Curia has to first validate its lineage. That means not just reviewing the original letter, but also the clarification the registrators copy, every cited commentary, and even the margin note from that bored monk in Avignon. It's bureaucratic genealogy. Meanwhile, theological scholars are brought in to assess whether the proposed revision would conflict with any earlier papal rulings. They end up revisiting an obscure 1387 decree about parish tithes, which leads one elderly cardinal to fall asleep in the middle of reading it and accidentally drool on a priceless vellum page. The page now has a permanent watermark shaped like a tooth. Quirky tidbit of the night. In some cases, requested revisions took so long that the original issue had completely resolved itself by the time a new letter was issued. In one case, a bishop died waiting for a clarification about how to reassign a monk, who it turned out had fled to France to become a wine merchant. Revision granted posthumously. Back to our letter. Eventually, Rome decides to grant a partially revised directive. This is where things get spicy. The revision doesn't replace the original letter, it supplements it. So now there are 2 versions, the initial decree and the new addendum. And guess what? They contradict each other in tone. The first says diocesan bishops may oversee the matter. The second implies they must. It's not a dramatic contradiction, but in church law, that's enough to spark another century of scholarly hair-pulling. And here's the fun part. The new addendum gets registered, indexed, and circulated just like the original. This means double the paperwork. Local dioceses now have to file both versions, create cross-references, annotate liturgical calendars to reflect pending clarifications, and remind priests during chapter meetings that the matter is under evolving interpretation. One weary cleric forced to rewrite the diocesan copy by hand adds a note in the margin. Let this be the final word, lest our quills wear to splinters. His wish, of course, will not be granted. Why? Because letters are never final in this system. They live, they mutate, and they return. Sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically. Just like that, your once simple piece of papal parchment has birthed a family tree of commentary, conflict revision, and recursive headaches. There's even talk of convening a minor synod to interpret both letters side by side. That's right, they might host an entire gathering of bishops to decode a difference in modal verbs. It's majestic in its way, or maybe just very, very exhausting. And as you float above the bureaucratic fray, you might wonder, was all of this worth it? To which the Vatican quietly replies, yes. Because divine order demands paperwork, and revisions are just the Holy Spirit's way of proofreading, you would think that once the revision is issued, once the clarifications are clarified and the contradictions ironed out, or at least pushed into a slightly more elegant ambiguity, your papal letter would finally be allowed to rest. But no, this is medieval church bureaucracy, remember? There's still another long, dusty chapter of the legal disputes. Because now that there are two versions of the letter, the original and the revised people start choosing sides. Some prefer the comforting vagueness of the first, others cling to the shiny new assertiveness of the second. And in an institution where every phrase can be the difference between land ownership and excommunication, you can bet those preferences don't stay philosophical for long. Here's how it begins. In a sleepy town near Bologna, a monastic order uses the original letter to justify holding onto a plot of land that a local bishop insists now falls under diocesan control thanks to the revision. Both parties cite papal authority, both claim righteousness, and neither is willing to compromise. So they take it to court. Now, before you picture a modern courtroom with gavels and juries, picture instead a cramped cathedral vestry, two clerical lawyers in enormous robes, and a third man, usually a bishop with indigestion, appointed to arbitrate. Here's your historical fact. Ecclesiastical courts in the 1400s had sweeping authority over church matters, and they operated on their own logic. Cases were argued in Latin, often without witnesses, and judgments were written in long, looping script that required 3 levels of interpretation before they meant anything. One misspelled word could change a verdict entirely, like the time a scribe accidentally wrote non-potest cannot, instead of potest, can, effectively outlawing a whole category of marriage. And so begins the interpretatio phase of your letter's journey. The lawyers line up their parchment scrolls. They recite from the original decree, then roll out the revision, and carefully highlight the differences, usually with phrases like, as was previously expressed in the papal voice, but has since been graciously augmented in His Holiness's wisdom. They debate the intent of verbs. Was the word assignare meant to imply a command or a gentle allowance? Historians still argue whether scribes introduced these ambiguities on purpose to make the letters more adaptable, or whether they were simply out of ink and patience. But these disputes don't stop at the local level. Other regions begin citing this case. Word spreads that the letter has been tested in tribunal, and clerics across Italy seize the moment to revisit their own grievances. Some quietly hope the legal chaos will let them sneak through exceptions unnoticed. Others genuinely want clarity. In one memorable instance, a group of friars in southern France sues a bishop for misapplication of papal tone. The case goes to appeal. Rome sighs and assigns a cardinal to investigate, who promptly gets lost in Provence for 6 weeks because someone forgot to send him the right roadmap. You can almost hear your papal letter groaning from within the archive. I was just trying to clarify a tithing protocol in Parma. Quirky tidbit time, at least 3 church legal cases in the 15th century referenced papal letters that didn't even exist. The lawyers invented them, usually lost in a fire or sent directly to the bishop's hands, and cited them with all the confidence of a drunk uncle reciting scripture. Sometimes the judges went along with it just to avoid paperwork. But your letter, oh, it's very real. And its presence in court documents gives it a second life this time as precedent law. Not just referenced academically or theologically, but now legally binding. Or at least legally relevant. This difference, of course, depends on who's interpreting it and how close they are to retirement. One bishop desperate to avoid the land ruling going against him even travels to Rome to plead his case in person. He carries the original copy of the letter well-worn, slightly wine-stained from a poorly timed feast day and waves it dramatically during an inquest. He argues that the revised version cannot apply retroactively. A clever point. He loses anyway, because by now another institutional layer has quietly wrapped itself around your letter intent memory. That's the Church's sense of how a document ought to be read. Not just what it says, but what it meant to say at the time, which may or may not align with what it actually inkedly expressed. And this idea of papal intent becomes the key talking point in law schools for decades. Professors lecture about the famous Parma letter case, using your letter to explore the tension between letter and spirit, between decree and revision, between authority and application. By the mid-1400s, your letter has become a minor case study in canon law, taught dissected, occasionally misquoted, and sometimes used to justify things it never once mentioned. It's absurd, it's beautiful, it's very, very bureaucratic, and it still isn't over, because legal rulings, while final on paper, often spark retaliation. The monastic order that lost the land in Bologna, they file an appeal with the Apostolic Penitentiary not because it has jurisdiction, but because they're hoping for a sympathetic ear and maybe a clerical loophole. The bishop who won the case, he writes a sermon about divine justice, quoting your letter at least 4 times, dramatically, emphasizing the revised clauses while looking straight at the friars in the front pew. It's a church-wide drama, and your little papal letter meant to resolve a simple diocesan process, has now participated in multiple lawsuits, inspired doctrinal debates, and helped spark at least one anonymous theological satire called On the Nature of Clerical Parchment. And somehow you're not done yet. Because legal rulings create new administrative realities, which means new directives, which means more letters. And those letters, they reference you, which means this spiral is only tightening. All because of a goat dispute and a slightly vague Latin clause. So, with the legal battle still echoing through cathedral halls and dusty archive drawers, you'd think your papal letter might finally get a chance to take a well-earned nap. But no. Now it's time for the administrative aftershocks. You see, church bureaucracy is like a stone tossed into a still pond. Every papal letter, especially one that's been revised and litigated, sends ripples that touch institutions far and wide. Monasteries, bishoprics, tax collectors, even the occasional confused sacristan who just wants to know which ledger to use. The rulings from recent disputes remember that mess in Bologna require implementation. This doesn't just happen by divine fiat. No, the church responds with new protocols, guidelines, and yes, additional paperwork. Clerical offices in Rome begin composing secondary documents known as acta executoria. These are implementation acts, bureaucratic breakdowns of what the ruling means, who it applies to, and when it takes effect. They contain long passages about the proper manner of record-keeping, a phrase that, ironically, no 2 dioceses interpret the same way. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor your dreams. The 15th century church relied heavily on canonical visitations, annual or semi-annual inspections of dioceses, to ensure that papal instructions like yours were being followed. These visits were part spiritual mission, part bureaucratic audit. Think of them as the Vatican's version of an IRS surprise visit. With incense. So, bishops and archdeacons now must organize visitations specifically to verify compliance with your letter. They carry freshly copied directives. They interview abbots. They ask probing questions like, have the updated forms been adopted in the chancel records? And when was the last time this sacristy recalibrated its procedural annotations? No, really, they did have annotations for annotations. These inspectors compile thick relazioni visitation reports, which are then sent back to Rome. There they're read by weary clerics who are either squinting by candlelight or nodding off over wine-soaked blotters. These reports often include subtle complaints like local clergy appear confused by multiplicity of directives, or some continue citing the pre-revision version due to convenience. Historians still argue whether this cascade of paperwork was a genuine attempt at orderly governance, or simply a way to make sure no one could ever claim to not be accountable. And so the bureaucracy gets busier. New flowcharts are drawn. Not with neat boxes and arrows, mind you, but and the margins of parchment using Latin abbreviations only the writer understands. One flowchart preserved in a Venetian archive literally ends with the phrase, et sic iterum ad initium. Rough translation. And so back to the beginning again. 2. Quirky tidbit incoming: some dioceses responded to the administrative burden by creating unofficial compliance songs. Yes, literal songs that clergy would chant to memorize the updated procedures. Picture a Gregorian chorus about tithing forms and signature chains. One of these chants, titled Modus Signandi Secundum Papam, survived in a monastic songbook and is deeply uncatchy. Meanwhile, back in Rome, your letter and all its derivatives is being woven into indices. These are the bureaucratic maps of the papal archive categorized listings of every letter, ruling, and procedural document issued in the last few decades. A bored but meticulous scribe has to update the Registra Vaticana, ensuring your letter is now properly cross-referenced under at least 4 categories: governance, property, ecclesiastical rights, and side-disputed clarifications. This scribe adds a note. See also debate Remodena misapplication clause late-stage revision. It's their only creative moment of the week. Here's where things get even more tangled. Because all of this paperwork, visitations, responses, revisions of protocols starts looping into other departments. The apostolic camera, the office responsible for the church's finances, gets involved. They want to know whether your letter has altered the flow of diocesan revenue. After all, if governance shifts, so might tithe distribution. And nothing gets the Vatican's attention quite like adjusted revenue lines. So now fiscal clerks are pulled into the fray. They start drafting rendicontazioni reports detailing the financial ramifications of the letter. One cardinal demands a spreadsheet. He is given a meticulously inked scroll instead, with tiny columns, little to no spacing, and a firm reminder that tables are not to be bent for convenience. Remember the guy who once used your letter to justify tunic lengths? He's now retired, but his former assistant ends up compiling a summary of all the ways dioceses have interpreted the document. This assistant is named Antonio, and he's one of the few people in this whole affair who seems to be having fun. He decorates his summaries with elaborate calligraphic birds and includes a running tally of which bishop is most confused this month. This summary ends up being so helpful that it circulates widely. Some dioceses request copies. Rome briefly considers making Antonio part of a new clerical task force for interpretive cohesion. He respectfully declines. Instead, he takes a sabbatical to copy music manuscripts for a cathedral choir. Historians still argue whether the post-letter administrative burst improved governance or merely created a thicker fog of paperwork. Some see it as the Vatican's attempt to maintain intellectual control. Others view it as bureaucratic inertia, a machine that once wound up can't stop even when the letter's original purpose has long faded into memory. And this is where the real irony comes in, because now almost no one remembers the letter's origin. The goat dispute, the priest who started it, the town, all lost in the thick folds of administration. What's left is the process, the reverent, recursive, reverberating process. Your papal letter has transcended its initial purpose. It's become infrastructure. Not a document, but a reference, a code. An assumed piece of canon law embedded so deeply in diocesan life that no one even reads it anymore. They just cite it. And comply, or try to. And so it rests not quietly, but ever so slightly vibrating within the cathedral of bureaucracy, until someone someday finds it again, and starts asking questions. And now, dear parchment pilgrim, your journey takes a strange and sleepy turn. After decades of bustling courtrooms, quill-frenzied offices, and protocol recitations, sung off-key by weary monks, your papal letter finds itself drifting towards something far less glamorous oblivion. But don't worry. Even in oblivion, the bureaucratic process refuses to let go of you completely. You're shelved. Not ceremonially, not lovingly, just quietly, practically. You're placed in a woodworm-bitten cabinet in a lesser chamber of the Vatican archives, sandwiched between a record of altar cloth inventories and a log of disciplinary actions taken against a particularly belligerent bishop who once tried to excommunicate a statue, This is where many papal letters go, to fade not into irrelevance, no, but into a kind of soft administrative afterlife. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. By the late 15th century, the Vatican's archive system had ballooned to include tens of thousands of parchment documents, many of them cataloged more for their potential not to be useful than for their active relevance. The simple goal, if someone someday needed it, it would be there. You are that it. You sit curled at the edges, your ink flaking just enough to stain the fingers of the occasional scholar who pulls you from the pile. And yes, you are pulled from time to time. Not for urgent papal business, mind you. You've aged out of that, but for more academic reasons. See, by the late 1400s, the Renaissance is bubbling into existence. Humanist scholars begin nosing around the Church's older documents, not just to interpret them, but to analyze them, to dissect them. One such curious mind is Father Matteo, an eccentric Dominican who writes a treatise on the evolution of episcopal syntax and legal missives. He finds you. He unfolds your brittle folds with reverent fingers. He traces the layer's original draft revision, the later marginalia penned by a fiscal clerk. He's fascinated. He calls you a testament to Rome's linguistic grandeur and grammatical paranoia. That's right, you're now being studied for grammar. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Matteo builds an entire argument around the shift from the verb eubimus, we command, to monimus, we advise using your letter as prime evidence. His conclusion. The Church was becoming more cautious, more strategic. Less fire and brimstone, more strongly worded suggestion. His critics suggest he's overthinking it. Matteo doubles down and lectures in Florence wearing robes embroidered with Latin puns. But Matteo's not the only one. Archivists start citing your letter in footnotes. It appears in a monograph titled Canon Law in the Time of the Wheat Tax, which only 6 people read, all of whom have identical spectacles and suspiciously well-oiled beards. Still, every citation keeps you alive. Each time someone opens the cabinet, uncurls you, and squints at the faded ink, you receive a breath of bureaucratic resurrection. You become a specimen and exhibit a dusty echo of how seriously the 15th century Church took itself. Historians still argue whether these archival rediscoveries had any meaningful impact on policy, or were simply the indulgences of parchment-loving monks with too much time on their hands. But Matteo insists your letter inspired a rewording of episcopal appointment formulas in his own order. That's a legacy, right? Meanwhile, outside the archives, life changes. Rome hums with a new kind of energy. Printing presses emerge. Their gears clatter with revolutionary potential. Bureaucracy, once the exclusive domain of scribes and monks, starts flirting with mass reproduction. Suddenly, old letters like you are deemed too singular, too fussy, too handwritten. You're not copied. You're not printed. You're too specific, too dense, too wrapped in context. No publisher is clamoring to print a revised clarification of a clarification about diocesan authority in Parma. Instead, you become part of the referential fog documents that aren't published but continue to be whispered about in the footnotes of grander publications. One day, an ambitious reformer wanders through the archives, sees your frayed edge peeking out, and murmurs, "Still this before," carefully sliding you back and locking the cabinet. Because yes, the Church is changing. Bureaucracy is evolving into something faster, more printed, more vertical. Papal bulls now come with seals and press-ready language. No more interpretive dances. No more goat disputes spawning continent-wide procedural drift. You're old school. But here's the thing. Old school has a kind of romance. One chilly winter, a novice archivist on his first day is told to organize Shelf 7. He finds you. He reads your opening lines. He doesn't understand all of it, who would, but he's enchanted. He copies out your final paragraph into his notebook and labels it Meditation on Holy Order. It's not accurate, but it's heartfelt. And so you begin to blur at the edges. You're no longer just a legal document. You're part cautionary tale, part ecclesiastical poem. Priests quote fragments of you during training exercises. A scriptorium uses your margins to test ink mixtures. A sleepy bishop writes a sermon inspired by your tone, not your content, just your tone, and calls it the patience of process. And then, back to the drawer. You curl further inward. The ink fades another shade. No one's copied you in years. But you've become something strangely immortal, an example. In a Vatican seminar room centuries later, a professor refers to you that classic case from the 1400s as a warning against over-revision. A student nods, writes it down, and forgets the citation. You've gone from letter to legend, all without ever leaving Rome. And here we are drowsily drifting into your final resting days. Not a dramatic end, not a blaze of bureaucratic glory, but a long, paper-thin exhale into near silence. You, this once vibrant papal letter, now slumber in a stack of near-forgotten documents inside a darkened wing of the Vatican archives. The room smells like beeswax, candle smoke, and time itself. You're bound into a compilation volume now filed under Miscellanea Documentorum, Epistolae circa ordinationes, which loosely translates to letters about that kind of thing. You share your tomb of parchment with memos on bell maintenance, an indulgence mistakenly issued to a deceased merchant's parrot, and a very persistent complaint about a rogue choir director in Avignon who rewrote all the hymns in 7 or 8 time. And yet, somehow you still matter, because now and then a new scholar comes looking not for you specifically, but for something adjacent. They're tracing ecclesiastical property rights, or researching how papal language shifted during the late Schism period. Their fingertips inevitably dusty flip your page. They frown, they squint, and then they read. Just a little. Something catches. Maybe it's the unnecessarily complex phrasing or the triple clause sentence about who can convene a local synod. Provided said synod shall not contradict prior instructions, save in matters of tithe and episcopal vestment. Maybe it's the ink smudge that resembles a duck. Maybe it's the footnote in someone else's hand that says, "This again, L. You are now not just a document. You're a thread in a centuries-long conversation about governance control and the excruciating love affair the Catholic Church has with procedural detail. Mainstream historical fact. For your dreams tonight, the Vatican's secret archives, renamed the Apostolic Archives in 2019, contain over 53 miles of shelving, with documents going back over 12 centuries. Many like you rest in bureaucratic limbo. Not discarded, not celebrated. Just kept. Just in case. Historians still argue whether this hoarding impulse is brilliance or madness. Some call it the preservation of legacy. Others say it's just a refusal to let go of anything, no matter how many duplicate records of candle purchases might already exist. And yet here you are not forgotten, just waiting. Waiting until maybe your next act. Because surprise modernity isn't quite done with you. Enter the digital age. It's the early 2000s. Everything is beeping. Archivists begin scanning old manuscripts, and a low-priority project to digitize obscure ecclesiastical letters happens to pull you from your centuries of slumber. You're unbound, gently, reverently, and scanned with a flatbed machine that hums like a sleepy cicada. You exist now in pixels. A graduate student in Lisbon stumbles across you in a Vatican metadata dump. They're looking for a case study on institutional memory. They don't read Latin very well, but you come with a clumsy English summary letter concerning bishop disputes and procedural reaffirmation, heavily annotated, rare revision cycle. The student downloads the PDF. You live on their laptop for 6 weeks just under their folder marked thesis stuff maybe. Eventually you make it into a paper. You're cited crudely, incompletely, but cited nonetheless. See Vatican Epistola 1447c, relevant for understanding revision fatigue in ecclesiastical correspondence. You're back in the scholarly bloodstream. Quirky tidbit. The digitization software misreads one of your Latin abbreviations as a modern Italian swear word. It's redacted from the official transcript and earns you, however briefly, a reputation as that spicy papal memo. And that's your legacy now, part museum exhibit, part meme, part miracle of survival. No one remembers the original goat dispute. No one quotes your opening clause about episcopal jurisdiction anymore. But you are there. You are still traceable. You are still someone's footnote. You outlived everyone who touched you. The scribe who first dipped the quill. The monks who sighed at your revisions. The bishops who misquoted you in court. The papal secretary who reworded your 4th paragraph with all the subtlety of a man trying not to get fired. Antonio with his calligraphic birds. Matteo who turned you into a grammar lesson. The student with the pixelated thesis. You outlasted them all. And now, you rest. Not lost, not famous, just suspended, timeless. A relic not of belief, but of the tireless machinery of belief. A whisper of how seriously institutions take themselves. A testament to the fact that in the church, even the most mundane memo can achieve something like immortality. You're still there. Papal letter. Folded, inked, indexed, remembered, just in case. So now, with your journey almost complete, let your thoughts drift slowly away from Rome's buzzing chancelleries and the rustle of vellum in dim archives. Feel the weight of the centuries lift gently off your shoulders. You've walked no trudge through dusty corridors of bureaucracy, watched as quills scratched out endless amendments, and listened to the solemn chanting of compliance directives by candlelight. And now, stillness. The ink has dried. The revisions have ceased. The debates have faded into footnotes and sleepier academic journals. All that remains is a thin line of memory, your memory etched softly across the annals of time. You don't need to remember every title, every bishop, every goat-related clause. Just the sensation of care, absurdity, and longevity. The feeling that even the most forgettable document might echo centuries beyond its final use just because someone once decided it mattered. Let your breath slow now. Imagine parchment curled like a seashell, ink that glistens just a little as the candle sputters low. A room full of silence filled not with forgetfulness but with peace. No more scribes, no more footnotes. Just you resting in the great library of history, soft, still, and nearly eternal. Sleep well.